In the previous video we saw how to work with query sets and managers. This is the 7th video, building list and detail views. In this video we'll first see how to create list and detail views. We'll then move on to add URL patterns for your views. In the end we'll deal with canonical URLs for models. Now that you have some knowledge about how to use the ORM, you're ready to build views of the blog application. A Django view is just a Python function that retrieves a web request and returns a web response. Inside the view goes all the logic to return the desired response. First, we'll create our application views. Then we'll define our URL pattern for each view. And finally, we'll create HTML templates in order to render the data generated by the views. Each view will render a template passing variables to it and will return an HTTP response with the rendered output. Now let's create list and detail views. Let's start by creating a view to display the list of posts. Edit the views.py file of your blog application and modify it by adding these lines of code. You've just created your first Django view. The post list view takes the request object as the only parameter. Remember that this parameter is required by all views. In this view we are retrieving all the posts with the published status using the published manager we created previously. Finally, we are using the render method shortcut provided by Django to render the list of posts to the given template. This function takes the request object as parameter, the template path, and the variables to render the given template. It returns an HTTP response object with the rendered text, normally HTML code. The render shortcut takes the request context into account, so any variable set by template context processors is accessible by the given template. Template context processors are just callables that set variables into the context. You'll learn how to use them in section 3, extending your blog application. Now let's create a second view to display a single post. For that, add the function to the views.py file using these lines of code. This is the post detail view. This view takes year, month, day and post parameters to retrieve a published post with the given slug and date. Notice that when we created the post model we added the unique for_date parameter to the slug field. This way we ensure that there will only be one post with a slug for a given date, and thus we can retrieve single posts by date and slug. In the detail view, we're using the getObject or 404 shortcut to retrieve the desired post. This function retrieves the object that matches with the given parameters, or launches an HTTP 404 not found exception, if no object is found. Finally, we use the render method shortcut to render the retrieved post using a template. Now let's see how to add URL patterns for your views. A URL pattern is composed of a Python regular expression, a view and a name that allows you to name it project-wide. Django runs through each URL pattern and stops at the first one that matches the requested URL. Then Django imports the view of the matching URL pattern and executes it, passing an instance of the HTTP request class and keyword or positional arguments. If you haven't worked with regular expressions before, you might want to take a look at this link. Create a urls.py file in the directory of the blog application and add these lines of code to it. The first URL pattern doesn't take any arguments and is mapped to the post list view. The second pattern takes the 4 arguments and is mapped to the post detail view. Let's take a look at the regular expression of the URL pattern. Year requires 4 digits. Month requires 2 digits. We will only allow months with leading zeros. Day requires 2 digits. We will only allow days with leading zeros. Post can be composed by words and hyphens. Creating a urls.py file for each app is the best way to make your application reusable by other projects. Now you have to include the URL patterns of your blog application into the main URL patterns of the project. Edit the urls.py file located in the My Site directory of your project and add these lines of code. This way you're telling Django to include the URL patterns defined in the blog urls.py file under the blog path. You're giving them a namespace called blog so you can refer to this group of URLs easily. Now let's deal with canonical URLs for models. You can use the post detail URL that you have defined earlier to build the canonical URL for post objects. The convention in Django is to add a getAbsoluteURL method to the model that returns the canonical URL of the object. For this method, we'll use the reverse method that allows you to build URLs by their name and passing optional parameters. Edit your models.py file and add this code. Here is the library, and in the class post add these lines of code. Note that we are using the strftime function to build the URL using month and day with leading zeros. We'll use the getAbsoluteURL method in our templates. Great! In this video we saw how to build list and detail views. In our next video, we'll create templates for the views.